Barry, let me see if I can hear you.
Hello.
Okay, I can hear you. Hey, we may have some additional guests today because, as you recall, for about two sessions now, Jack has been attending, and I mentioned that Jack actually has. Let me mute that.
Computer, shut up.
Jack has a team that is called Topic Quests, building something called Knowledge Gardens, which I believe he's told you about, and you probably remember him discussing. Anyway, he's also spread information about this particular meeting, Saturdays and Sundays, to his team. So one or more may actually arrive, or zero, depends. But anyway, the invitation has been sent. That's a big ass mug. What do you have in it?
Well, at the moment, it's empty. It was coffee.
Wow, it looks like it's been heavily used for coffee.
Yeah, well, it's a BBN logo, and I've been at BBN for like, what, 20 years now?
Bolt Beranek and Newman?
Yeah.
I'm sad I still remember that. I remember when they had the fastest imps on the internet.
Well, they invented the imp. They developed the
I know
very,
they were the
very first
fastest
imp.
nodes on the internet, is what I meant. What was it? 40K bit or something like that?
I don't remember what was funny about it was it was supposed to be called an inter um, internet message processor. Anyhow, the headline of the blurb got modified to interfaith message processor.
Interfaith?
Oh, it's supposed to be interface. It's supposed to be interface message processor. And when they released the news blurb, the editor of the paper changed it to interfaith message processor because the interface didn't make any sense to the editor.
Oh. Okay, I get it. One of those early spell check errors.
Interfaith message processor was it was headlined as Walt Braddock and Newman develops the interface message processor.
And there was a sufficient editorial review that actually got out.
The thing is that they had sent it just a press release, and the guy who did the headline just you know put interfaith, and that was the headline. The body of it was correct, just the headline. So if you read the body of it, it said interface. Anyway, that's one of the earliest jokes of the internet technology, the interfaith message processor.
Just out of curiosity, how is the audio? Because it's coming across this Logitech webcam.
It's good enough. I mean,
Yeah,
the way you can tell is you look at the speech to text and you tell if it's making any mistakes, and it's not.
I should turn that on.
That's the best way to check your own quality of audio. If you're on the wrong microphone, if you're on the distant mic, you'll tell it doesn't get all the words.
Hmm.
See, it says you're on the wrong microphone if you're on the disinvite the intelligence.
So I'm curious, on your machine, which I assume is the iMac, which you normally use,
Right.
the little box where the captions or the text comes up, can you move it around and put it somewhere else in the window?
Yeah, yeah. If I put the mouse over it and left click, I can drag it.
Okay. Because I only recently tried doing that, and lo and behold, it lets me do that. For a long time, I never even tried.
Yeah, it's great if you're on a desktop. I'm not sure if it's the same on a mobile app. And on the hybrid system at the community center, you can't move it at all because there's no mouse on the interface of the big room system. It is where it is. At least you can turn it on.
Okay. There's Jack.
There's Jack smiling His smiling face.
Yep. Hey, Jack.
You tell.
I was just letting Barry know that there might be a slight possibility that others of your horde might join us today.
Yeah, Marc Antoine can join tomorrow. I know that much.
Okay, cool.
I don't know about the others.
All right. And we were just reminiscing about how I saw Barry use a BBN mug, and I remember the days of Bo Baranek and we were talking
Oh
about
yeah.
the old fast internet days of what, 40 kilobytes per second, kilobits per second. And yeah, Barry was alive in those days. I'm sad to
So
say you and I were both alive in those days.
yes. And I used to read a lot of BBN papers. And I don't recall whether I actually went there or not, but I have a sense that I probably did visit somebody there.
I,
Man,
But
we are some old fogies right here.
I
yeah,
met Frank Hart. Frank Hart was still, he was the head of the group that developed the interface message processor. And he was still there when I was there in the 90s. And at the 25th anniversary of the development of the internet, they had a big party at MIT, and Frank was there. And in the 90s, we were developing K-12 educational applications on the internet. And I asked him, I said, 25 years ago, when you were developing, the early technology, did you ever imagine the school children would be using it? He said, never in a million years would I have guessed that.
Arguably, he should have.
Well, yeah, the thing is that it was I mean, it wasn't even, it was only 4 nodes on the network, and they were high tech, UCLA, and I forget all the others. So, but
Wait,
yeah, but by the time
UCLA, was Carnegie Mellon one of those?
I don't, MIT, UCLA, and 2 others.
I
Might
think
have
it was
been,
Carnegie Mellon, might have maybe SRI.
yeah, you can look it up. I'm trying to do it from memory. It would be ridiculous for me.
I think of
either
it.
SRI or it was NASA Ames. There was something about Doug Engelbart going down to NASA Ames and attaching to their internet, something like that. I don't remember.
You can ask one of the AIs and tell you.
I remember, here's the story. In 1976, I think it was August or September, I was at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh because I had gotten into a ruckus with my dad and he tossed me out. So I went to go visit my mom for a couple of weeks because school hadn't started yet. I was supposed to start Stanford in late September, but he didn't want me around. I didn't want to be around him. So I went to go live with my mom for a couple of weeks in Pittsburgh. So she didn't know what to do. She had a job, so she had to go figure out something to occupy my time with. So she set me up with a friend of hers from high school or some early stage schooling, a guy named H.T. Kung. And so he was in the computer science department at Carnegie Mellon. So she said, "Hey, can you look after my son and entertain him or, take him to some classes or whatever?" So it turns out that H.T. Kung is the father of the systolic processor,
Oh
one of the
shit.
first parallel architectures.
Right.
Okay. So he had me sit in various different classes. I remember one of them was an APL class. And I remember I attended 2 demos that day. One was on a system called Harpy, and another was on a system called, it was a counterpart to Harpy. I used to know this. Anyway, the two early voice recognition systems, 2 different architectures, both at Carnegie Mellon, both demonstrating on that very day. And the other one, not Harpy, but the other one, I believe, was the one that basically was architected in something called the blackboard model, the blackboard architecture.
Mm.
So I got to sit through a lecture and a demo of voice recognition using a blackboard model in late 1976 at Carnegie Mellon University, one of the first feats of AI. And I remember the other thing he had me witness was he sat down in his office and he said, do you know what I'm doing right now? And I saw him type a bunch of stuff. He said, I'm actually sending a message to this person. It was on the West Coast, either UCLA or, SRI or one of those places. And it was early. It was 1976. And he said, this is called electronic mail. So he demonstrated electronic mail to me in September or August of 1976. Anyway, it was only much later that I found out that H.T. Kung was fairly well known, but he was just a schoolmate of my mom's. And he just happened to babysit me for the day. Sorry, I just reminiscing. Sorry for ranting. Thanks for listening. And by the way, I've been a fan of Blackboard model architectures ever since.
Oh, have I? So have I. When I got a contract,
Hearsay. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Sorry, the artist system was called Hearsay. All right, carry on, Jack.
yeah, hearsay, yes. Um, when I got a contract to develop an expert system for the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to control an autoclave um, for uh, for carbon composite processing. I used a blackboard. I had a PC, an ordinary PC, with two plug-in um, uh, M6800 cards, and one was for reading data from sensors in the autoclave, and one was for making decisions. And they so one posted to the blackboard and the other read from the blackboard. The PC was the blackboard, and the Air Force patented
Yeah, it's nice.
it.
I think Blackboard was an early version of what I think now we could even call it EDA, event-driven architectures. And so I believe a lot in event-driven now. Highly parallel, not centrally, all funneled through a database.
Well, a blackboard where you subscribe to
Yeah,
a topic or
flow
a
of data, flow
right,
of state.
right. And that's how I wrote it. But I did it all in fourth.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember you telling me that. Yeah. All right, Barry. Any story you want to tell? Because Jack and I have both had our turn now.
Um, well, since my memory is fading, I don't remember any of my past life.
Okay, you just posted something about the
Yeah, I put a query into Google and it said the first four nodes were UCLA, University of Utah, and SRI. Actually, it's only listed three of them. It didn't list BBN. It only listed three of them.
I wouldn't have guessed Utah.
Oh no, it said University. Oh, Santa Barbara.
Well, it did say Utah, and I have not ever, that has
I
never impinged on my consciousness before that that was one of the early nodes.
I thought Utah was in the list, but I'm surprised it doesn't say BBN.
Well, I'm surprised that Utah hasn't made, more notoriety out of that.
Um, yeah, I'm surprised it doesn't say BBN. Since maybe BBN wasn't on the arc. Maybe they only developed the hardware, weren't actually on the network. I don't
They
know.
couldn't afford one themselves, right?
I don't know.
Anyway, hey, since you guys are both here, and Jack, by the way, the this particular group I loosely call cosense making and deep blocking, but it's really the origin was really to try and bring some rational, systemic, scientific, mathematical thought to things that most people just normally gloss over and say, well, that's just the way it is. Okay. So I'm trying to figure out, whether we can get deeper into these phenomena. And Barry has been, I think, so far, one of the most consistent participants in all of this. And I usually come with a few questions, but usually it turns out that that is over preparation. So now I've limited it to a single question that I bring to these particular meetings. And sometimes the session gets very lively, and I don't even have time to, introduce that first question. But anyway, usually I bring one, and after everybody checks in, after an appropriate time, I lay it on the table and see if there's anything that people want to discuss about it. So I came with one today, and after people check in, I was about to ask that one particular question and see if that's of interest to you all to delve into today. But if not, there's there's never been a dearth of topics for us to talk about in this meeting. We typically go on for quite a while, or at least for 2 hours.
Well, throw your question out there. I'm curious.
Okay, Barry, you ready?
Yeah, got my ears on.
So the question that it usually comes out of stuff that I've obviously, encountered during the intervening week. Let's see, Stacy. Oh, she just said she can't make it today. Okay, feeling sick. Okay, sorry. I'll ping her later. Okay, so the question I came up with was, and it brings me back to that story I told about, an incident that happened on my very first job. I think I remember telling that last week. But it's this whole management notion and organizational notion that we drive organizations from metrics and MBOs. Now, I first encountered this
MBO.
management by objectives.
Okay.
Okay. So in other words, you set, certain goals, and you're supposed to have what? Magic numbers 3 to 5, no more than that, because that then, makes you not focused. So you're supposed to only focus on 3 to 5. And so the theory goes that the organization, usually the CEO or president, sets 3 to 5 goals for an organization, either that quarter or that year. And then his direct reports, his or her direct reports, then have 3 to 5 MBOs that then feed up into the higher level MBOs and objectives. And the objectives are measured. There are actually metrics that are applied to these things. And that's how you determine, hey, did you do a good job or not? Did you actually, use your budget wisely or not? Did you deploy your people wisely or not? Are you going to get your bonus, and how much of your bonus are you going to get? So those are typically, what happens in organizations when this happens. And I got to thinking, I don't like that. I really don't like that.
Terrible.
It's a horrible system. And when I
It's only
first heard
measurable.
that Intel was the one that sort of introduced this to the industry, what, 40, 50 years ago? I don't know. When did Intel come around? Wait, it was the late 70s. Yeah. So I think,
Right after Shockley's company fell apart.
yeah, I think it was around 1980 or 79 that I first encountered Intel. And I started working with an Intel 8080 and Intel 8085 chip, 8-bit chip. So anyway, his who's that famous CEO from that era? He was the one that sort of made MBOs famous. And I thought, isn't this going to create a skewed organization? Can't you take a more systemic view of what an organization is really trying to do? You only need to focus on 3 to 5 things. So the question I'm bringing up here is, and I express it the following way. Don't MBOs and metrics detract from a systems view of organizational performance and organizational alignment? To me, it seems obvious, but why is it that, so much of industry still chooses to do it this way? And then years later, quarters later, say, oh, well, that was an unanticipated outcome. We didn't anticipate that. We didn't foresee that. Well, geez, if you're only focused on a small set of things and you're not paying attention to the bigger picture, to me, it's obvious that there will be unintended outcomes, unintended consequences. But people use this term of unintended consequences like, oh, well, that's just life. No, it's not life. It's because you're thinking in a simple-minded way. So what I'm claiming, and this is definitely counter to most management wisdom, is metrics and MBOs. If you manage by those, yeah, you can work in the short term fine, but long term, I don't think it's a smart way to do things. So anyway, that's the question or thesis I would lay on the table for today. And it's perfectly fine if you have no interest in that, whatever. I just wanted to rant. That rant is enough for me. But if you want to discuss it any further, I'm ready and willing. Over.
Well, I think the person you're thinking of is Gordon Moore, Moore's
Is
Law.
who?
Gordon Moore was the founder of Intel, and he and like what 7 or 8 other people worked for Shockley. Shockley was a terrible manager, and they rebuilt.
Wait. I think Gordon Moore was the guy that had Moore's Law, but I thought there was another East European CEO that was famous for this MBO theme.
Well, then it wasn't the Intel guy.
I mean, it could be him. I could be remembering wrong, but I thought it was like definitely East European um, CEO of Intel that.
Moore founded Intel, so he was a CEO.
Hmm.
I think he was a CEO. I don't know what else he would have been. Founder.
By the way, do you know that Gordon Moore credits Doug Engelbart for Moore's Law?
No, I didn't.
Doug was actually the first to actually make that observation.
But the irony here is that Gordon Moore and the others that went to Fairchild and all the other rebels knew that the unmeasurable feature of Shockley's transistor company was that although he knew his physics, he was a terrible manager of people. And so you would think that Gordon Moore would have known that unmeasurable things, sort of abstract things like, management, caring about your employees, which is not a measurable objective, is very important. And it's sort of ironic that that these technically measurable objectives sort of displace all the ones that are important, but kind of spiritual or emotional or cohesive. I mean, in the Army, they know that cohesiveness is a big deal. The Army knows about cohesiveness. You can't have a team if you're not, if everybody's fighting everybody else, to get the highest numbers on sales or whatever it is that you're measuring, that it breaks up cohesiveness, the teamwork. So that's kind of ironic, I think.
It sounds like that's transactional and you're looking for relational.
Exactly. Yeah. Do I enjoy working with my colleagues? And are we working as a team collaboratively and not competitively because of these stupid objectives that whoever gets the highest number on some objective is the one who gets the raise, the bigger raise.
Right.
Yeah. And I also think it's also so defocusing because if you have a good idea and yet that was somebody else's job, you're not supposed to say it. And if I do say it, then that's stomping on that person's territory or responsibility, and that's a no-no. That's what I was taught.
So it's just another aspect of collaboration versus competition, teamwork.
It wasn't like that at SRI. It was pure collaboration.
And I wish I had worked there.
To me, it was like a breath of fresh air. When before I worked at SRI, I worked at VerticalNet, and that was competitive. And Adam Chire was my boss at VerticalNet, and so when he eventually got back to SRI, he brought me in.
There's another funny story. You talk about memories. I'll tell you a funny story about SRI. SRI, there was a guy at SRI who was working on cold fusion. He was funded by EPRI, the electric power. And CBS.
Wait. What year was this? Was this late 80s or was this earlier than that?
I think it was in the late 80s, early 90s. Because I think Pons and Fleischman at Utah were like in the late 80s, like 87, 88.
Right. Yeah, somebody at SRI picked it up.
So the problem was that they were getting more electric power out of these electrochemical cells than they were putting in. So they're getting more heat out than the electricity they were putting in. And the question was, where's this extra energy coming from? The theory was it was some kind of fusion reactions generating extra heat. And this guy at SRI had published a paper explaining how he measured electrical power going in. And he was using a constant current power supply made by a Japanese company called BEPCO. And so he took the value of the constant current and multiplied it by the fluctuating voltage, and that was his calculation for the input electrical power. And I look at it and I go, that's not right, because if that was true, your ordinary desk telephone wouldn't work, because the ordinary desk telephone had a variable resistance in the microphone, and that gave you a fluctuation in the current, and there was power. There was AC power in that fluctuation. And the question is, if you try to use a constant current power supply to drive a telephone, would it work? And the answer is yes, it would. And it's not a complicated piece of engineering calculation, but he was ignoring the AC noise from the fluctuating resistance. And you form the bubbles on the electrostatic plates. You change the resistance of the cell, and that causes these transient currents, which are electrical noise, which on a telephone that would literally be electrical noise, and there's power in electrical noise. And here's the irony. CBS 60 Minutes did a story. They went to SRI and did a story. And you could, back in those days, you could still even find the video from it. And you could see the trace on the CRT. And I'm thinking, here's the film crew from CBS. It includes a video engineer and an audio engineer. And an audio engineer has a VU meter, because these measure. If he had put the VU meter across the terminals of the cell, he could have seen the VU, which is the electrical power of the noise signal, which the guy at SRI was pretending was zero. And I wrote that up. I wrote it up as a comment on the 60 Minutes thing and other places. Nobody paid a whit of attention to it. Nobody paid a whit of attention. That the mistake was they were calculating as if it was a genuine constant current power supply and not a fluctuation. And EPRI, which makes its money by calculating AC power, was funding this. There's your funny irony, that EPRI, who should know better, was signing off on this paper, which was saying there's no AC
the
power.
Research Institute.
Yeah.
So the story that I read somewhere online, and I think it was Bill Moyers, but I'm not sure, said that system blew up and killed him.
It's true. One of his cells exploded from the hydrogen. He had a hydrogen explosion, and it hurt. I can't remember the guy's name now. He was from Australia, and he suffered a lifelong injury. I don't know if it was to his eye or to his arm or something, but yeah, there was shrapnel. So one of his things blew up because of the generation of hydrogen gas that caught fire, and then they basically changed their safety protocol after that. But the guy who did it never acknowledged that his simplified calculation of electrical power going in, ignoring the AC component, never acknowledged that that was a mistake. And people at MIT who were calculating input power were using a real input power measurement device that wasn't just an assumption that there's no AC component. And if you're in the business of telephony, you know damn well that the AC voice signal got power in it. Otherwise, it wouldn't propagate. It wouldn't work. Where telephones wouldn't work. Even Edison, understood that the variable resistance carbon transmitter was able to make it a real telephone. And it was a few percent. I mean, the DC power going in was much more. The AC power, the signal or the noise power was 5% or something of the DC power going into the system.
So continuing with that track, where are we now? Is tokamak still the most promising fusion uh, option? Are there better ones?
Um,
Or is cold fusion still alive?
well, they don't call it cold fusion anymore. They call it low energy nuclear reaction or LENR or something like that. And there are, for example, if you use muons, mu electrons, instead of real electrons, you that changes the size of the atom, and you can actually get some fusion. But you always, all the ones that they've tried, you get less fusion power out than electrical energy going in, even though you're getting some, even though you can get some fusion. And there's a couple of other ones. Sabine Hassenfelder mentioned yet another approach. But they all have the same problem that even though you're getting some nuclear fusion, because you can see the neutrons or whatever the byproducts are, you're still pumping in more total energy into the whole system than you're getting out. And the ones at SRI, the little bit of extra heat that you were getting out was explained by the AC noise power that you were pretending wasn't there. It exactly matched.
Back to Shockley for a moment. Sam, did you ever see Shockley's original lab?
I don't
Now,
think so. You mean at Fairchild or earlier?
No, no, earlier. It was over in Menlo Park. Um, and my
Oh,
memory,
Schlumberger?
huh?
Was it Schlumberger?
No, it was just
Rocket
that
transistor company.
Shockley had a little white building on
No, I
the
never visited, unfortunately. I should have when I was there, but I
I don't know
didn't.
if it's still there or not.
well, no, it's not. When I started living in that area, I can't remember the name of the big cross street from El Camino. It's the one that goes into Google. Um, it was sitting there. It's a little white building, but it was an Asian market. But the market had a little plaque on the window that said this was Shockley's lab. And so when a shopping center decided to come in and take over the entire area, which included a Sears and the Sears Auto, everything. It just cleaned it, leveled it entirely. Um, they put a they put a they put a some metals in the sidewalk that said this is where Shockley invented the transistor.
Well, he
But
invented it at Bell Labs.
well, it's where he had his lab in Palo
Yeah,
Alto.
it's where he was trying to build commercial transistors to
Right.
sell, as
And
opposed
so
to the
that was
opposed to, yeah,
Shockley's lab,
yeah.
and it's now nothing but a commemoral set of medals in the street. I took Linda down and walked her down to see it. Yeah, she had worked at Cisco Systems when I met her, so she was familiar with the space.
Bardeen,
Now,
one of the three people, was, Shockley, Bratton, and Bardeen were the ones at Murray Hill. They all got the Nobel Prize. Bardeen got a second Nobel Prize for something completely different, entirely different. But the story is, when Bardeen attended the first award ceremony, he didn't bring all of his family. He brought one son and left the others at home because they were in school. And the king, that was the king of Sweden, was unhappy about that. And Bardeen says, "Well, the next time I win a prize, I'll bring everybody." And it was true, he did. He won a second Nobel Prize and brought everybody. But nobody can tell you. They have to look it up. What did he win the second prize for? Some other device he worked on at Bell Labs later on. Not as famous.
And 5 decades later, where are we now? 6 nanometer, 3 nanometer? Where are we now?
I don't
Three.
know. But
I've heard as low as 2 nanometers.
Two already? Wow,
I've heard as low. I can't confirm it.
that's
we're
remarkable.
going into photonics and some other technologies which are pretty exotic so far. Who knows?
And it was Lennox Eurisco that invented high-rise um, chips that stack transistors on top of transistors.
He's
Yeah.
credited with that, really?
Well, let's just put it this way. It discovered them on its own. There's a paper about it. They ended up bringing what's his name from Caltech up to Stanford to show they could build them.
Hmm.
And by the way, what's his name at Caltech that was famous? Um, he owned a home in Palo Alto up on the hillside. Um, that if you looked at it from the aerial view, looked like a transistor.
Huh.
It had a central core house, and then it had four concrete pads and arms sticking out to it. And so it kind of looked like an IC chip.
Yeah. And then there's a water tower in Holmdel, which was intentionally designed to look like a transistor, and it's still there.
Where's that?
So Holmdel, the Bell Laboratories location in Holmdel, New Jersey,
Oh
has
yeah.
a water tower, which was designed by Eero Saarinen in the building, and the water tower was, if you look it up, it's supposed to represent a transistor, a three-legged and a bulb,
Right.
and it's still there. And that property is now called Bell Works. It's a multi-tenant office building, and there was a movie that used it as for exterior scenes for a recent Netflix movie. They used the Bell Works building for their exteriors. What was the name of the movie? I can't remember. It's a current movie on Netflix. Go ahead, Sam.
Since we're talking about depictions of transistors, in 1982, my parents bought me a violin or commissioned a violin to be made for me by a very good violin maker. And I had taken lessons from her husband. He was my violin teacher for many years. So they knew me really well. I visited them every week. But when she made this violin, she personalized it. So in the scroll of the violin, which is really the neck and the piece that holds all the pegs to the violin,
Mhm.
she carved an analog circuit diagram
Oh no, no.
because she knew I was, in tech. And inside the violin, she put a little poem with 4 lines, and each of the 4 lines corresponded to the 4 inputs to the logic diagram. And I thought, what a unique little gift. So I still have that violin. That's the one I still play every day. Oh, not every day. Every time I play, that's the violin I use that I'm on.
That's some really brainy people you hung out with.
Yeah, she is very unusual. She was an artist. Um, she played cello and she also made violins. She's won many violin and instrument making competitions in the US. Her name is Ann Cole, Cole, lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She's made cellos, violins, violas, viola da gambi, interesting instruments.
I've seen TV shows on how they make violins, and it doesn't look to me like it's easy.
I don't think anybody's ever said it was easy.
They're
Although,
competing.
there are now mass production lines for violins now, surprisingly, but the best ones are still made by hand, supposedly.
Speaking of famous people, I went skiing with Arno Penzias when I was at Bell Labs.
Three
Oh my.
degrees, 3 degrees Penzias, right?
It was very interesting. We were on the long bus ride up from New Jersey to the ski area, and so we had a couple of hours just chatting. You know, his whole crew was there. It was really, and some of their children were with them too. The children were so bright. It was just a fabulous time.
Hmm.
So did he talk about background radiation to you?
We didn't really talk about the 3 degree, but we were talking about lots of things. And um, the one thing I remember is that he disclosed some advice from his wife. His wife said to him, Arno, he says, when you're in front of a camera, don't do this, do this. Don't do this, do this.
Yeah.
Do that.
And I thought that was an interesting piece of advice from his wife. Don't do this, do this.
Who is the Zoom users? Is
Oh, that's
Josh.
Joshua.
Josh.
Bridge.
Joshua Bridge.
So anyway, we've meandered a ways from my original question. I guess it led us to some things, but anyway, I just wanted to conclude that little rant with the fact that, in fact, in large part, my interest in systems thinking, model-based reasoning, uh, is to try and make sure that we're all thinking big picture more than just simple little MBOs. And out of MBOs come all these guidelines like be smart, SMART, and all these other little practices, which, yeah, in the short term makes sense, but it confounds me why we are constantly puzzled by long-term unintended consequences when all we give import to are these short-term, this quarter, next quarter kind of simple
Exactly.
MBOs.
We don't
So,
have
Jeff,
reliable models of the whole ecosystem, including the non-measurable, the poorly measured elements, the affective, emotional, spiritual, personal relationship elements.
one of the victims of that kind of thinking to me is quality. Think about, these teams that always want to build the first thing, the minimum viable product, So you take a use case and you have 12 user stories. And, if you did all 12, man, this would be really usable and people will love it. But yeah, we can ship with just these four. Let's just ship with these four. And then after it ships, it's like, okay, forget the other eight. Let's go on to the next feature, And that's the practice that to me always degrades quality and usability and just, the well-roundedness of a product. Anyway, I could be too much a purist here. Obviously, people who think that way get rich. People who think like me don't get rich. But unfortunately, we suffer. And I think it's partly because of this.
Well, one of the last things they worry about is human factors. I worked very closely with the founder of Human Factors Engineering at Bell Laboratories, a guy named Carlin, and he was sort of he was the head of the Human Factors Society and founder of the whole discipline, and that was sort of the realization that it's not just whether the telephone works, but whether it's easy to use and whether people get frustrated and annoyed or irritated by features that don't take into account the relevant human factors.
So do you have any inside stories of how the phone number keypad got laid out the way it did?
Well, the one thing that John Carlin was actually famous for was when you had the rotary dial and the numbers were printed on the outside of the dial and people were missing the number. And he came up with the idea of painting a white dot in the center of the hole. So it gave you a target for your finger. And that dramatically reduced the amount of misdialing of the rotary dial. That was the one thing that was pointed out. It was his most important contribution to field. But the touchtone push button, I don't know if there was really any great stories about that, except that I think it's opposite of what's on your computer keyboard, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
It didn't standardize.
Those two are flipped.
Yeah. And I think the touchtone keypad did it come before the computer keyboard or after? They were sort of about the same time, I suppose. But I don't know why that ended up, with two different standards, the computer keyboard versus the telephone touchpad.
I also don't know whether early typewriters,
They
early
did.
typewriters didn't have the number keypad, did they? They just
Oh,
had the
no,
number of keys
they
on the
were
right.
they were across the top, just like there is on your keyboard without the touchpad. The numbers are at the top row, above the QWERTY row. And of course, we also have the same thing that why do we still use a QWERTY keyboard when, that's a very poor, well, the reason for the QWERTY keyboard was to slow you, literally, to slow you down for the manual typewriter. Now we don't need that, but we stuck with the QWERTY after, century, no more than a century. I think that wasn't the typewriter in the late 1800s, I think.
Well, Jack and I will tell you that a corded key set might be something that higher end people might choose to use, but there's not a great manufacturer of those that we can actually use.
Well, probably speech in lieu of keyboards. I don't know how long it's going to be before we get rid of keyboards and it's just pure speech.
I think it'll always be a mix. Certain things you can do faster with key clicks rather than talking.
Well, but when I try to do
Faster
typing,
than you can actually push a mouse around.
I make so damn many keyboarding mistakes anymore. I don't have the dexterity that I had when I was younger. I try to do crossword puzzles. I'm always hitting the wrong key. And the new smaller laptop keyboards are even worse because the keys are so close together.
They are.
Small form factor laptops.
Go back to the Commodore PET.
Was that a large one? I don't know.
No, it was your hands were like this on it. You couldn't spread them out. It was a keyboard that was maybe 7 or 8 inches wide.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. It's poorly human factored.
Yeah, remember what they used to call chiclet keyboards?
Chiclet. Yeah,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
do you know I don't own a telephone? There's no
Landline.
there's no landline in my house.
I
Well,
haven't for years.
I still have the physical telephones from the 1960s vintage Western Electric models. I still have several of those model 500 sets. And three of them, I think, or three or four of them.
So this would be curious. I think I last paid a landline phone bill probably around 2009. And ever since, I've only had cell phones. Me and my family and I. So yeah, no landline ever since then. About 14, 15 years.
That's about the same for me.
And while I own a smartphone, I don't have a cell phone number. I do have Google Voice, but I have to be on the internet for it to work. I have a smartphone that Sam Chan sent, an iPhone model that's now considered beyond its sell-by date.
Okay.
I have Samsung, and then I have my daughter gave me her old iPhone so that I could have an Apple Watch.
Same here.
Yeah,
I have the one that goes with the iPhone, Sam
right.
Chan's.
That's the only thing it's used for is for the Apple Watch.
Okay. Then let me connect the bridge or build a bridge again. I mentioned and Jack confirmed that at least one of Jack's colleagues from Topic Quest might be coming tomorrow. And I've participated in two recent calls of Jack's team because they're building a knowledge gardening platform for, knowledge work, obviously. And I was very curious about what they are calling the scoring system. How do you assign points to participation? So that got me into a couple of conversations that Jack kindly invited me to. And so in case it comes up, that's what prompted some interest in Jack's team in participating in these weekend calls. So just wanted to give you that other half of the connection there. It's probably a very rough bastardization of what actually happened, Jack. So if you'd like to correct that, feel free.
Well, two of us, at the time he was Aditya Bhatia, and I used to drive to Sam's office building in, was it Sunnyvale?
Yes, on
And
Kiefer.
Kiefer, and we would go to his evening meetings there and have a great time. They were awesome meetings. Um, but then Aditya went and joined the army. And in the army, he chose to use the name his mother gave him, which was Sonny, because people in the army would butcher his Indian name, Aditya. And so he's Sonny Bhatia in the army, although he's Captain Bhatia and soon to be Major. Um, at the time we knew him, he was here on a green card, and he had a day job, which his green card sponsored, but he really wanted to participate in the whole Inglebardian space, all of the doings that his job wouldn't let him do. So he became a volunteer um, um, IT guy for the Tech Museum in San Jose. He ran their whole internet infrastructure. And it was somewhere in there that he and I started going to Sam's meetings, and then he goes off to the army, and I asked him why he joined the army, and he said because they'll make me a U.S. citizen the day I graduate from boot camp. And I said, well, why do you really want to go? And he says, well, I really want to play with the big tanks, and the big toys. And I said, they're not going to let you. And he said, why? And I said, you're too fucking smart. He was a certified Microsoft developer at age 12 in India. And that's because his parents did the right things. They got him computers, they helped him into boot camps at school and all kinds of things. So he is just far and away above anybody that normally signs up for I'm not denigrating the other people. I'm just saying he's one of those 10 Sigma kind of guys. And I said, they're not going to let you play with those toys. And he said, how do you know? And I said, because they wouldn't let my brother when he went to Vietnam. My brother went and took their IQ test when he signed up for the army, and he scored head and shoulders above everybody else. And so they gave him a rifle and let him stand on a pier and shoot anybody that swam up near the pier, but they did not let him go near any of the heavy toys. And mostly they put him up on a bunker hill somewhere and kept him out, out of harm's way. And so yes, no, they did not let him. They let him jump out of airplanes, but they didn't put him anywhere near the big iron. And when right after he graduated boot camp, I got a call from the Secret Service. And they said, we wanted to talk to you about Batia. And I said, please do. And so they came out to a little shopping center in Campbell, and we sat down for coffee. And I said, you're really lucky to have that guy. And they said, we know. And so they assigned him to a brand new cyber command spook shop that the army created. So he's teaching at West Point now, and he's just major brainy and a lot of fun. Marc Antoine, who you probably will see tomorrow, is French Canadian, Quebecois, And he's really brainy. So when I started on this project of building a platform to tame human conversation, um, that was in 2010. I had just I had just defended a PhD thesis proposal and was busy building a program to defend it, a dissertation, when a Carnegie Mellon West professor um, asked a question in Palo Alto, how can we have civil conversations online about politics? And my answer to him was World of Warcraft meets global sense making. And Barry, you're right in smiling about that because in general, yes, it's impossible. But it turns out that if you bring people into guilds and you basically the guild there's a social dynamic in guilds that you can't escape or you leave. You just say, this isn't for me, and you leave. Um, uh, the idea being that you actually learn how to start listening to the other side, and rather than flashing your own ideas before the other side is finished talking. Um, so we decided to use the World of Warcraft model and build a new kind of social network. And so my new thesis is in order to tame conversations, you have to tame humans. And the only real way to tame humans, since that's a cultural shift, is evolutionary. You're not going to just go in and teach a lecture and give a quiz on Friday and have them walk out being better citizens. It's not going to happen. It never did. So we're building an ecosystem that fundamentally allows those who participate, and we hope to put it in classrooms. I've already had one classroom teacher say, "How soon can I have this?" And she's a teacher at a Christian school, Christian middle school. They still want it. Um, it's just a different way of pedagogy and andragogy and the whole thing. It's a different way of being. Um, so that's the platform we're building. And I have to say that when I think about it in the early days when we started Topic Quest Foundation, we really didn't think about scoring. I had been playing Jane McConigal's Foresight Engine game, which was a structured conversation game online, but it was in the first person shooter genre. And trust me, those people that played that game were not, they were rambunctious, rowdy. Whereas if they'd been inside of guilds, my point is Jane's scoring mechanism encouraged long conversation tree branches. She called them builds. If you engage somebody in this tree branch, how tall can you make this tree branch rather than forking it and going in another direction? And so her scoring mechanism was that. And uh, Marc Antoine came along and said that's the entirely the wrong approach. Um, that was building a leaderboard where the guy at the top, and I was at the top because I understood the game and I understood the scoring mechanism. Um, it just meant that I outcompeted everybody. And so I always won that game until I published the scoring mechanism in a blog post. And after that, it was all I could do to stay in the top three because other people figured it out and said, oh, yeah. It turns out that the right way to have people answering you is to ask questions rather than making bold statements. So anytime somebody would make a bold statement, I'd pounce on it and say, "How do you know that?" And I just walk them on down the tree until they finally say, "Well, actually, I don't know." And so I was king of the hill. Um, what I'm saying is, Marc Antoine is working on a scoring mechanism that actually rates guilds on how collaborative they are with other guilds. This is very difficult. And Sam had some ideas in that space, and so we dragged him in. And I'd like Sam to come back as frequently as he can because he's one of us. It's not he can't escape it. And Barry, I would actually like to engage you in our conversations if you're ever up to it.
Well, I can tune in. I don't know. I may be aging out of a lot of this stuff. But you and I are the same age, so maybe not.
Well, I'm 80.
Yeah, I turn 80 on Monday.
Oh, go. Happy birthday. Yeah, well, good for you.
Jeez, I feel like the kid here.
Yeah, you are the kid.
Well, maybe Josh, who's connected, but not who's on
Oh,
scam.
my Josh might be the kid. I don't know. Yeah, my wife for my 80th birthday uh, uh, treated us to a family dinner on a riverboat in the Sacramento River in Sacramento called the Delta Queen. It's online. It was a boat that sank sometime in the 80s, just right, was tied up to the dock and it just sank. And so some investment company came and bought the rights to it and hoisted it up and and repaired it and turned it into basically a hotel with a ballroom and a restaurant bar. And so we did a gigantic family dinner, and I invited people that weren't in my family, a fellow named Howard Liu and his wife and his 6-year-old son. Let me tell you this story. This is another one of those Renaissance thinkers. Howard came to America from Hong Kong at age 5. And by age 9, now in Hong Kong, you spoke Shanghaise. You didn't speak Mandarin. The Mandarin and Shanghai use the same symbols, but they don't mean the same.
Wait, not Cantonese?
Cantonese, yes. And as I said Sheshe to Howard's mother, and he looked at me and said, "She doesn't know what you said." And but Howard was speaking fluent Mandarin by the time he was 9, and that's because his father started a Chinese restaurant in Sacramento, and I guess Howard hung out there, and there's a gigantic Mandarin diaspora. Um, but Howard, in the ninth grade, took college calculus through a course from UC Berkeley. And in the 12th grade, he was a uh, a foreign exchange student in Germany. And he came back from Germany fluent in German, uh, Sanskrit, and of course all of his other languages. He chose to learn Sanskrit while he was in Germany because it's the ancient language of knowledge, and he really wanted to get deeper into it, so he taught himself Sanskrit. While there, his parents offered to put him through medical school, and they gave him a Stradivarius violin. Now, it
Awesome.
wasn't one of the high-end violins. It wasn't one of Itzhak Perlin's versions, but it was the line training violin but it's still a Stradivarius and it's still a drop dead gorgeous violin. Great sound. But he said, no, I want to be a mathematician. So he came back to the United States and he was all but dissertation at UCLA in math, pure math, not applied math, pure math, when his father passed away. And being the eldest child in a family, Chinese family, you know what that means. He came home and took over the father's business and built it up to the point where he could sell it and decided he needed a job. So he read a book about Java programming and went into the money store and announced he was a Java programmer and got a job. And right after they hired him, they hired me. That's where we met. So after run this out a couple years, and we both were at Vertical Net for a while. And then he's sitting home with nothing to do, and he decides, I want to learn something about applied science. So he started taking biology and physics and chemistry at a local junior college, and he phoned me and he said, this stuff is really interesting. Now, this is a pure mathematician doing applied science. So he decides to up and take the MCATS test for med school, and he passes it. No training. He's now an MD.
Jack of all trades.
I consider him a Renaissance thinker. He's just way out in front of everybody.
Multi-talented.
Now he's an MD in at Kaiser Permanente in Sacramento, so he still lives in his parents' home. It's now his, and he married a pediatrician whom he'd met while he was an intern at UCLA, and as an intern, they put him in Spanish Barrio. So he taught himself Spanish so that he could deal with his patients in their language. And he wrote an iPad app in Spanish to help clinics onboard new patients. I just like to
I,
hang out with brainy people.
I like that story. I especially like that you mentioned he started in mathematics with a strong interest. If I could, I'll take 30 seconds to tell you a story about somebody I know. I used to work for a very high-tech company called ESL. And unlike most companies, they do zero marketing because all of the work is undercover and classified.
Yes.
So they never even want their name to be known. Anyway, ESL stood for Electromagnetic Systems Lab. And one of the things we did, the one thing I can talk about is we used to do acoustic ocean modeling of acoustic propagation given depth, density, salinity, temperature, water flow, the geographic structures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And we had some of the world's best acousticians. And we had one on my project, and because those guys are so rare and so skilled, he got bought, basically swayed away by a competitor for a lot more money. We couldn't keep the guy. So I was looking around for someone who could understand all of these models and take on the job. And I interviewed another guy who had a PhD in physics. And I said, this is a very complicated model. You know, you're going to have to dig in deep and assure you that you can understand all these principles and work the model and refine it and make it good. He said, I have a PhD in physics. I can do anything. So in fact, I did hire him and he did a very good job. So some of these guys who, you know, come up through very rigorous scientific and mathematical thinking, especially physics, uh, attain a degree of competence that isn't bravado. You know, at that level, it's not bravado. And I didn't see it as vibrato. Sorry, bravado. Anyway, I just thought I'd enjoy sharing that story. So thanks for listening.
My best manager at Bell Labs was a PhD in physics. Far ahead of everybody else that I ever reported to was this one guy, Peter Pipperell, who was PhD in physics. I love the guy. He was fabulous. The other managers, forget him. Just do awful.
So, Jack, one of the things I'd like to share about Barry is I don't know if he spent much time talking to you about it before, is his theory of learning and how emotions affect learning. And he's got various different works, blogs, presentations on this topic. But one of the things that attracted me to Barry is, of course, you know, my interest in collaborology. And I also have mentioned before some of that, the inspiration for that comes from Isaac Asimov's Foundation stories, where someone, a mathematician, develops a branch of mathematics that models human behavior at a grand scale. Okay. And he, Asimov, okay, called that branch of mathematics psychohistory. It's a term I don't particularly like because I think it's not as powerful as it could be. But Barry has also postulated that, hey, if we could develop this theory well enough to develop a mathematics of learning and emotions. Well, in collaborology, I was thinking, could we actually take some models of human behavior at an atomic as well as at a macro level and develop a mathematics around the societal and sociological phenomena? So a placeholder name that I use for that is sociomatics. So that's the word that I'm trying to head towards if we understand collaborology and sociology well enough, is to try to develop a mathematics of it called sociomatics. And Barry may have a different term for his as well.
Jack, didn't you mention that you have a son who's into applied mathematics or teaches mathematics or something like that last week?
I don't have a son that does that. My son is 3D animator.
I can't remember, but you did mention something that spurred me to wonder if you knew about what Sam was just talking about.
I do. I do. I mean, I've been watching the Foundation trilogy on Apple TV and I read the books. And remember that psychohistory was not about the individual. It wasn't at the atomic level.
Is
It
at
was
the grand level, yes.
the mass level. And at my age, I'm blocking the name of the famous mathematician that invented it and blah blah
Harry
blah.
Seldon.
Harry Seldon, yes. Um, but by the way, I don't think the Apple TV thing kind of follows the book that well.
It does not. It does not. Only loosely, very loosely.
It's entertaining, but it's not, it doesn't follow it.
Anyhow, I put into the chat the summary of my research: cognition, affective learning, the role of emotions in learning. And it's a mathematical model that's based on Newton's calculus, is the core mathematics. All you need is basically freshman calculus to follow the model.
I've opened the link, yes.
Yeah. The key idea is, if you think of a learning curve, you always see these sort of generic learning curves where people say, well, you learn fast at the beginning, then it kind of levels off. And they always have these kind of monotonic learning curves that level off. And I pointed out that when you learn, you don't learn error-free, that you gain some information which is later discarded as incorrect. So a learning curve really has wiggles in it.
Right.
It may have an envelope that's ascending, but it has the ups and downs. So it has second derivatives, not just a slope, which is learning, the rate of gaining knowledge, but it has a second derivative, which is the wiggles. And the question is, what's the second derivative? What is that? How does that show up? And the answer is, the higher order derivatives, the wiggles, shows up as affective states. And that's the whole point of the theory, is interpreting the wiggles of a learning curve as recognizing affective states.
How can I apply that to guild technology?
Well, in a
That's
guild,
a good conversation for us to have.
So in a guild, presumably you're trying to find the optimum practice for your guild. There's to discard inefficient or ineffective practices and supplant them by effective practices. So if you're laboring under a misconception, say you've got a mental model that includes some gaps and misconceptions. And because of your gaps and misconceptions, some of your practices are suboptimal or even ineffective, even dilatory. So what happens is, if you're trying a method and it's not working to your satisfaction, you're disappointed or dispirited, or you have some negative valence emotion, frustrated. And so the negative valence emotions are your cue that something is either missing or incorrect in your understanding and your reduction to practice. And so metacognition is about recognizing both what is the knowledge that you have reliably and knowledge that you're relying on, which you haven't really confirmed, as opposed to affective states, which are saying there's something not quite right here. I'm not happy with this. And then metacognition is how you resolve that. And this mathematical model gives you some tools for thought for doing metacognition.
My God, I'm stoked. Now, if Marc Antoine shows up tomorrow, and really, if Sonny shows up tomorrow, he's teaching. I'd like to dive deeper into that.
And one of the offshoots of that is characters in a story, whether it's a real story or a fictional story. One of the offshoots of that is a character model, a generic storybook character model.
Mm-hmm.
And so in addition to the main core of the calculus of the motions of learning, thinking of the wiggles of a learning curve, you have this spin-off of the character model and generic storybook character. And what's interesting is that there's some theorems that come out of it. So like in game theory, you have some classical theorems in game theory. And there is a generalization of game theory model that turns up in dramaturgy. And I call it Clancy's theorem, after Tom Clancy. And the reason I call it Clancy's theorem is because it was inspired by the title of one of his novels, The Sum of All Fears. One of his books was called The Sum of All Fears. I thought, the sum of all fears sounds like the left side of an equation. And so I took that, literally, and I worked out the generic generalization of a game theory theorem and came up with Clancy's theorem. And it's in that same paper. It's one of the sections, the second half of that paper that I can link to. So you get dramaturgy and metacognition and just a mathematical approach to calculating the interplay of emotions and learning.
I think that's brilliant.
It's original work. When I first developed this material, and I shared it with some of my friends, especially professor at MIT, she thought this couldn't be an original theory. This has got to be in literature someplace. And I told her, I can't find this in literature. She says, you're not looking hard enough. She says, I'm going to do a literature search and find this. And she couldn't find it. And she ended up writing a survey paper for literature search. And in the process, she coined the discipline affective computing. So my friend Ross Picard is the founder of affective computing, which she initiated because she thought that my work was not original and she was going to demonstrate that it was already literature, and it wasn't. There was almost nothing about computational models of affect. And so she says affective computing needs to be a discipline. And she founds the whole theory, writes the whole book called Affective Computing in 97, I think.
I trust she gave you credit.
Well, in the book Affective Computing, there's exactly one half of one page which she mentions the model. Because when she wrote it in 97, it hadn't really been developed very far. We eventually got an NSF grant in 2001, and then we wrote some peer-reviewed papers. And my very first peer-reviewed paper, which just basically presented the mathematical model and nothing else, won the Best Theory Paper Award at the International Conference on Advanced Learning Technologies.
I can see why. That just makes so much sense.
It was a novel mathematical model that was just simply nothing like it in the literature. You had all these narrative models of affect, but you didn't have any mathematical models relating affect to learning. And this is, I simply basically said, model the wiggles of a learning curve. What's the second derivative and higher order derivatives? What are they? The answer is affect, emotions, and astonishment, and disappointment, and all these other narrative terms. Go ahead, Sam.
So, Jack, you can see why I can connect what Barry was doing and my interest in Barry's work with the human system side of what Doug was representing. And Doug, unfortunately, didn't develop that very far. But with that and with my interest in collaborology, that's where I'm trying to bridge that gap.
So this,
along with the 5 or 6 other projects you and I have talked about.
this Doug, I don't think of Doug as a mathematician so much as Barry. I think of Doug as basically a farm boy that went to college and saw something that nobody else saw and pushed it. And that's that,
He's a self-built visionary.
he is, and that makes him very special. And I believe that Ted Nelson is equally very special. He was the son of theater people, movie people.
Show business is in his blood.
And I've seen his mother on episodes of Columbo. She's quite a hoot.
Sorry, who's his mother? I don't remember.
So he is Theodore von Holm. Oh, her name is Holm. Yeah, Barry, you're going to see this coming. Words just go away.
Yeah, I have the same problem.
Yeah.
By the way, Jack, you attended his 3-day soliloquy in Palo Alto, yes? Ted
Mhm,
Nelson's.
mhm.
Yeah, I attended all those myself, but do you know if any of those or all of those are recorded anywhere?
Do not know.
Those would be fascinating to have for history.
I recorded him giving a talk at Stanford in a sideshow of the Semantic Web Conference in 2003. I was the videographer of that, and Mary Keeler sent me uh, the a copy of it. So I have it, and I can probably find a way to put it online for you or something. If I can even find it anymore. I don't know if I can find it.
Yeah,
I've moved a bunch of times.
yeah.
But he invented his own words, as you know. And that made him difficult. I got a story to tell about him. I went to an A-Life conference in New Mexico in order of magnitude 1991, something like that. And it was whatever year he published his book Computer Lib. And they had a little place where vendors were selling stuff. And I went up to his table and I took one look at him and said, "This can't be." And I walked away. I mean, he was had hair down to his shoulders and he just looked really motley and strange. So my my first opinion of him was diametrically opposed to what it became later when he finally cut his hair and I had him over to dinner at our house once in Palo Alto and spent a lot of time with him. Uh, but he is he's one of the advanced thinkers.
Did you ever see a Kurt Vonnegut clip where he gives a mathematical curve of story arcs? You ever see that video of his?
No,
If you look up Kurt Vonnegut on YouTube, um, and
I'll do that.
and he basically gives you some classical storylines, and he draws on one end is one this axis is time, and this axis is happy or essentially positive and negative
Emotional state.
emotional state, and he draws classical stories, and he basically draws stories, and I thought that's an perfect example of this, um, you know, turning the elements of a story into a mathematical model. He does it without numbers; he just draws sort of pictures. And the other thing is that you just use the word fascinating. Do you recall the famous sci-fi character who always said fascinating?
Spock.
Spock. Spock was the science officer, non-human. He was Vulcan, and he was supposedly like Data without emotions. But fascination is a classical emotion of a scientist. He was the one who was trying to figure. He was the one who would address the crisis, see it as a puzzle to solve, and he was fascinated by this being challenged by a puzzle. So there's another example. He did have emotions. Fascination was his most prominent one, but perplexity and puzzlement was in there too, because part of it was to figuring out what the hell's going on and then what's the best practice for handling it.
I clearly don't understand emotions because I don't see fascination as an emotion.
Oh, but I do. Fascination, curiosity, puzzlement, those are classical emotions. And if you look in the phase, when you have an oscillation, you have phases. You have ascending, concave down, descending, concave up. So you have like the phases. Another thing you have an oscillation. So you have these four phases. The first derivative and the second.
First and second derivative, yeah.
Right. And if you look at the four quadrants, in each quadrant, you have characteristic emotions. Quadrant one is when you're first looking at something, fascination, curiosity, and you're constructing a model because you haven't got one yet. Then when you have the first model, you start to make predictions and you test them. And if the reality doesn't exactly agree with the prediction, then you go to quadrant two, which is some kind of disappointment or frustration or perplexity, like what's wrong with, why is my model not agreeing with observation? And then if you have a mistake, you have to discard some component of your model which is incorrect, the misconception. That's quadrant three. And then when you throw away the misconception, then you're back to quadrant four, which is now I'm going to start over again, roll up my sleeves and try to get more data and build a better model. So you have this cycle, this phase plane cycle in the phase space of first and second derivative, which is part of the metacognition thing. Where am I in the phase space?
Do you think they teach this in teaching college?
No, that's the problem, is that I've introduced this to people who I thought might want to teach it either in psychology or um, neuroscience or learning theory or whatever. And as near as I can tell, it never caught on, except that when I went to a writer's workshop in Iowa, they have a summer writer workshop in Iowa, and there's a bunch of classes. And on the last day, they have the big banquet. So I'm sitting at the table with my group, and the table next to me turned out to be the Hollywood fiction writer table. And I was explaining to one of my people at my table this theory of emotions and learning. The guy at the next table says, "Can I listen in on this? This sounds very interesting." That was the guy was the Hollywood story writer. And so there, so it does intrigue them that there is this mathematical model which characterizes their practice. But near as I can tell, it never really found its way into the curriculum.
Well, it should.
It should. I think it should. And I hope someday it will. But I have not found any inroad to getting this. Like, for example, if you're teaching, say, freshman calculus, and you're classically showing ballistic trajectories, because that's the beginning of calculus, and I can think of another example, which is the emotions and learning application of the calculus. And I would think you would get a lot more interest from your students if you taught them not just the ballistic example of calculus, but the wiggles of a learning curve, and then interpreting that with Newton's calculus and the phase plane diagram. And I would think you would suddenly have a whole lot more students much more fascinated by the power of
that makes so much sense to me.
Yeah.
My God.
And not just, yeah.
It's
the best work I've ever done my whole career.
I'm trying to invent a new kind of social network, and everything that you're saying fits in that domain. It fits.
Imagine how this, Jack, factors into quote unquote a scoring system. Now you see my interest?
It would factor not only into a scoring system, but into lesson plans for guild leaders. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I would like to have an EDU associated with our Federation of Epistemic Communities that teaches collaborology. You know what I'm saying? And in other words, in order to level up into the position of guild leader from all of the other roles you could possibly play, you have to take, it's another badge. You have to take
Mhm.
a course and pass the
Yeah.
quiz or whatever.
And oh, by the way, through centuries, the military approximates some of this understanding. And I'm sure Sonny / Aditya would recognize a lot of that because he, went through a lot of that training himself. But imagine if they got, a more sophisticated model, such as what Barry's talking about, and we could then apply it more precisely and or with better understanding of the grounding phenomena, right? Let me just say one more thing. When I look at what's offered in today's entertainment networks, what strikes me always is how primitive these emotional models are of the primary entities, the actors, the principals, the villains. They still exhibit such arcane, primitive emotional states driven by the amygdala, very little frontal cortex, involved. And I see, geez, can nobody ever project how we could be EQ much, 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 higher than we are today? And yet we still use the same emotional states, the same emotional models, the same primitive um, hostility motivations, conflict motivations, disagreement motivations. even, projecting 20, 30 to 50 to 100 to, thousands of years from now, we still have people that still exhibit all of this primitive behavior. It's like, we think that the species will never level up. And that's how little people appreciate how primitive we are today in emotional state. So again, partly because the human system side needs to evolve, which Doug recognized, and what Barry is working on, and what Collaborology is interested in. That's where I'm interested in making those projections into the future. And I see so much lost opportunity in all the entertainment that we've been fed, spoon fed, actually shovel fed by all these people who think, oh, these are the stories that generate interest. These are what people want to watch. It's because that's all that, entertainers could even think of. Anyway, end of rant for now. Over.
So, Jack, you may be the first person who actually finds a way to pick up the ball and run with this stuff and pass it along to the audience that I could never find, access to. You're muted.
Jack, you're on mute.
Let me put it this way. I'd like to give you that audience.
Yeah, the problem is that I have not been able to. I'm very poor at marketing. I'm good at theory. I'm poor at marketing.
That isn't our need. Our need is people behind the scenes helping us, basically co-creating an ecosystem that scaffolds exactly what you're talking about. I don't need you out selling it.
Yeah.
I need you helping us make it whole.
Yeah. So, in addition to that article, that's the summary, I also gave a link to the YouTube video where I am on camera presenting that very same article to an audience. And that's the one, it's like an hour and a half presentation to a local group that I did a couple of years ago. And that's basically the sum total of the material and then if you want to dig into peer-reviewed original stuff, you can, but you don't really need to. You can just take it from this. When I first wrote that up, I wrote it up on Google Knoll. You remember the Google KNOL Knoll?
Yes, I remember it well.
And so because you can't write your own work on Wikipedia, that was against the rules. I wrote my own work on Google Knoll, and the editors of Google Knoll rated it as the #1 article on Google Knoll, 15 years ago when I first put it up. And then, of course, they shut down Google Knoll in a couple of years after that. And so it's the same article. I just had to move it to a different site. But it was rated. It was featured as a top rated encyclopedia article on Google Knoll, 2010 or 11 or 12, something. It was.
Cool. I think Josh has his hand up.
Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, hey, good to see you. While you guys were talking, I just decided, you know what, let me just check with some of these chat bots on some AI and see if it knows who coined the phrase. And it came up with Roz Picard. And I said, can you do the math that Barry is outlining in this effective computing that he's talking about? And it did it. So I posted it up to the Facebook group if you want to look at that and see if that makes sense to you. But I'm just saying, you know how you said search engines can't find your stuff? Well, obviously it found it.
Yeah.
So
actually, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I used the Socratic method, which is how I normally do presentations if I can. I use it with, I think, ChatGPT. And I said, can I lead ChatGPT to construct my theory from scratch just by asking questions? And so I did a session with ChatGPT, and in 20 minutes, it constructed pretty much the whole theory just from me prompting it with questions. And I saved that transcript, and it's up, I think, on medium.com or someplace like that. I can find it if you want to.
We would like that link, and I'm not on Facebook, so there's no way I can read what you did.
Hey Barry, by the way, a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, you did one or more sessions in this forum, or precursor called Barn Raising, and you spent some time going over that
Yeah,
presentation and that
yeah.
theory. So
I remember
that's
Kayla.
another good
Yeah,
video
Kayla
that
or
you might want
somebody
to share.
brought up an opening, and I gave at least a brief synopsis of it then, and maybe further on later. Let me see if I can find the thing on Medium here. How do I find my own stuff?
So Jack, you see the connection that's attempted here?
Uh, do I see it? My God, it went off like a nuclear weapon.
Yeah. So I did what's called the AI Whisperer thing on Medium, where I asked it to discover the relationships between emotions and learning, um, essentially by Socratic method. That's the last thing I just put in the chat here. So that's a demonstration that with prompt engineering, you can get anything that's reasonably intelligent to construct the whole thing from scratch, step by step. The problem, of course, with ChatGPT is that it doesn't incorporate that into its general knowledge base.
That's the
ChatGPT
problem.
throws it away.
Right.
So I proved that it could construct it, but then it doesn't retain it as a contribution to knowledge. It just throws it away. And that's the
If if, it,
that's
if you publish it, it turns into material that can be used for future learning cycles.
I did a number of prompt engineering exercises, and one of them, a different one, I put it up on my blog, the interpretation, and then I asked a new instance of ChatGPT to read that and say that conversation between me and another entity, was that between a human or another instance of ChatGPT? And it says, oh, that was another instance, that was another human, but in fact it was ChatGPT. It didn't even it even thought that its responses to me were those of a human. And that's up on my blog someplace if you need.
So the Turing
That's
test passes
the
the
test.
Turing test from a bot.
It doesn't
Yeah.
even recognize that that was its own work. It thought that work looks like it was done by a human, and it said why it thought it was a human. That was my respondent, my correspondent.
Okay, this is causing neural breakdown. You know what I'm saying?
Neural overload, maybe.
Neural overload. Yeah.
Which neuropeptide is surging? Can you
Yeah.
name the neuropeptide? Serotonin,
Well,
I
it's a
wish it.
chance
endorphin,
to dig new grooves.
probably endorphins.
Yes, it's more endorphins and dopamine.
Yeah.
Yes.
And in the future, they can probably sort of start to measure these neuropeptide surges, which right now people can report them if they're cognizant of neuroscience. But most of the time, an educator doesn't get very good data on neuropeptide surges with their mentees or students unless they can, get some physical.
See the action. Yes.
Most of the time, their eyes glaze over. They're wandering away. So anyhow, that's my claim to fame and contribution to knowledge. And I keep saying, I don't even need credit. Just pick it up and run with it. Take it to the next level or the next audience.
I don't have the chops to do it. Marc Antoine might, but I don't.
So if you know somebody who might, I thought maybe your son would be interested in this when you describe his work as an animator. Because in animation, you have to show characters who are expressing emotions like inside out.
Yeah, he's so my son is let's just put it this way. My son is purely right brain and my daughter is purely left brain. Now my daughter could probably do something with it because she did a BS in psychology, but she lost her interest in math when a seventh grade math teacher gave her a bad time and she was on her way to being very brilliant and that that just killed her.
You know, between your son and your daughter and Mark Antoine and your other correspondence, maybe one of them will get turned on and jazzed up and dig into this and figure out a way to make good use of it.
Well, so she just completed a book-length manuscript in the sci-fi fantasy genre, and I've read it. I've read parts of it as it was coming along, and helped her think through her phraseology a bit. And I think it's not a Harry Potter and never will be, but it's in the genre of Harry Potter, and I think she's very gifted.
So it's one of those Bildungsroman coming of age stories of an adolescent coming of age.
Well, yeah, she's right at the coming of age.
Yeah, Bildungsroman is a very nice genre in which this kind of stuff is relevant because in the coming of age stories, the Bildungsroman genre, you've got a character who is building mental models of the world that they're embedded in, and then testing those models by having adventures and misadventures and finding out where their insight is on target and where their insight is backfiring, and so on.
I don't think she sees it that way. She thinks of it, uh, I can't speak for her, but I don't think she sees of it the way you see it. She
Well,
may be
yeah,
familiar
you
with
could
that
ask her
model.
whether Bildungsroman, as the name of a coming of age genre, has any connection to how she perceives her stories.
I will.
Because character, I mean, the whole thing about character building is I have a character model, and a character model, I mean, if you have a character who never changes, that's kind of a static character. That's not a very interesting one. What's interesting are characters who evolve, who change the aspects of their character model little by little as a result of their experiences in the drama.
Yeah, I'm thinking her character is a character in a world where children with certain gifts, have basically tattoos on their eyelids so that they can be spotted. And so she has to walk around in town with a cover over her face and blah blah blah. And eventually, over time, she proves her mettle, and her culture is forced to accept her.
Yeah.
And it's through this series of adventures.
Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer story. That's your basic outcast who becomes the hero.
Well, that's what she did,
Yeah.
and she was very creative in the adventures she created for them.
Yeah.
Some of them pushed the limits of my ability to accept the credibility of it, but you know, that's poetic
From
license.
zero to hero. That's your classic. The
Well,
outcast becomes a
she
hero.
has elevators in a castle, in a donkey-driven society. You know what I mean? Was a little.
Anachronisms.
Yes, it was hard for me to swallow that one, but I let it go.
Technological anachronisms can wreck a sci-fi story.
Well, she might explain that they have donkeys on pulleys on the outside or something. I don't know, but I didn't push it.
Anyhow, there you have it. So that's my contribution for what it's
Well,
worth.
today has been for me a blowout.
Excellent.
I'm gonna have to take a nap.
Well, and I gave you a lot of stuff. I gave you a couple hours worth of material to look at, which I expect will take. I mean, really, this is a semester's worth of material if you really were trying to present it to a college level audience, you would basically spread it over a quarter or a semester.
Yeah. Well, um, I'm going to introduce the whole thing to my tribe and see if they're up for inviting you to one of our sessions
Okay.
when Sam is there to talk about it because it truly does impact scoring, and I think that impacts more than just scoring,
Yeah.
impacts how guild leaders are made.
Yeah. And the kind of things that you would like to be able to measure with some degree of precision, such as affective state, recognizing and measuring the intensity of affective states, and then tying that back into the dynamic of learning. And
I don't know how you know if we put uh, electrothermal sensors on people's fingers or something. I don't know. I don't know how you do that.
I think self-reporting, if you give people emotional intelligence, you make that a part of the curriculum so people can say, oh, I'm feeling vexed and perplexed, or I'm curious, or I'm fascinated, or if people can simply disclose, recognize and disclose their own affective state and make that part of the dialogue, then you don't actually have to have objective measurements. People simply can be relied on to reliably report their state verbally.
So that's a UE thing. You know, I begin to think about little icons, and you poke an icon when you're thinking this or thinking that, and
Right.
it goes into the record,
Right.
time stamped, and so on and so forth.
Make that part of the conversation. Make disclosing affective state with the correct either verbal or nonverbal presentation visible, recognizable, meaningful.
Sonny needs to hear that. Yes.
I think it's one source, but in my view, an unreliable source.
It can't,
So
well,
I think
very young people, it's unreliable. At some point, maybe in high school or undergraduate, emotional intelligence where you can recognize your own affective state and be safe in disclosing and candid in disclosing. If you can make that
I
part of
think
the
very
culture,
few people actually get there.
well, because we don't teach emotional intelligence. Daniel Goleman thought
Well,
it should be
even
part of
those
the
who
curriculum.
pursue emotional intelligence, I consider very few actually get there. I mean, it's all good in theory until someone's caught in the moment and actually in a triggered moment.
It has to be
When you're
part of the
triggered,
culture.
your frontal cortex goes away.
The
And
movie
that's the
Inside
problem.
Out, you know, remember the movie Inside Out, the animated movie, where you've
Yes.
got the half a dozen key
Yeah.
sort of basic
It was
emotions.
good to introduce to kids. It was very
Yeah.
good.
And so the idea is that a movie like Inside Out can help acculturate people to the fact that we have emotions, emotions are there, and should you conceal them or should you disclose them?
But
And
very, think about that.
and in a competitive
That's
culture, it's disadvantageous to disclose them. In a collaborative culture, it's advantageous to disclose them.
right. I was about to say something similar, which was in the West, that was innovative and that was a good way to introduce things to kids. Let's say in societies where you have kids learning to meditate from the time they're like, 5 or 8 years old, it seemed anathema to introduce a movie like that to such a culture. So you have to do it where it's appropriate. And there are other places much better than the kids or adults here in the United States. I mean, just look at the level of what's called a national discourse here in the United States. It's at a very low level. And a lot of it is very triggering. And a lot of people get triggered by it. And they don't think, they just get triggered.
By the way, the one activity where I was able to introduce this, and I did this at the Science Museum, is I had a whole collection of manipulable puzzles. I brought my bag full of puzzles in, set them up on a table, and the visitors of the Science Museum would pick up a puzzle, children or adults, and they would work the puzzle. And as they would work the puzzle, they would go through a learning curve where initially they don't know how to solve it, but they're intrigued. They would make an assumption, which is often wrong, how to solve it. It didn't work. And they would literally experience, one of these learning cycles in a space of 20 minutes. And I would narrate, or not narrate, but sort of interject Are you feeling perplexed? Are you frustrated? I would sort of prompt them to do metacognition at the same time that they were working the puzzle. And with some people, it worked fabulously. I mean, there were people who would do the Stoopy dance of joy when they figured out how to solve the puzzle, give them a high five and all this stuff. So making the expression and revelation of emotion part of the activity with the puzzle activity was one of the better ways that I found to do this as an extracurricular activity. I even did it in classrooms. I would take my puzzle to the classrooms and set them up on a table, and kids would take a time out and spend half an hour at the table with the puzzles. And I would go through this whole thing. And the, some of the kids, just got so enthused and so excited, and literally the endorphin highs from solving a appropriately selected puzzle of the right level of difficulty. That was part of my role, is to try to figure out where they were and what kind of puzzle would be just the right level, not too easy, not too hard, the Goldilocks puzzle. So they would solve it in 10 or 15 minutes with some effort and then get a thrill.
Did you ever try a Rubik's Cube?
I never mastered the Rubik's Cube. I owned some, and I even saw people who mastered it. But I understand it's what's the group theory stuff, and I never really got adept at the group theory stuff. But there were other puzzles that I basically did eventually figure out how to master it. But also how to prompt. The Tower of Hanoi turns out to be one of the best ones, because you can prompt somebody to solve it with the Socratic method. And that's one of the things that I developed at the Science Museum, was using the Tower of Hanoi, which is challenging, but if you ask the right questions in the right order, you can prompt them to figure it out, and then they get a high because you didn't give them the answer. You only gave them the questions.
I used the Towers of Hanoi on my kids. My daughter eventually solved it. My son was baffled.
Yeah. But if you do it the way I did it with the Socratic questioning at every stage, like what's your goal? The goal is to get the whole stack from there to there. So you get them to say the goal. Okay. Now, then you say, okay, imagine that you're at your goal. If you're at your goal, what disc is going to be on the bottom? And they can answer that. Okay. I said, in order to get that disc on the bottom, where do the other discs have to be in the meantime? This is your recursion.
There you go.
And so if you ask the questions carefully crafted, you can work them through the recursion process backwards until they figure out where to move the first disc.
Right.
And that's the trick. The trick was, and it turns out you can do the Socratic questions pretty algorithmically. Now, if they give the wrong answer, then you can ask maybe a more basic question, but it's not that hard to come up with the right set of questions to ask, to lead somebody step by step to reasoning about what do I need to do first? What do I need to do before that, until you get to what can I do now?
The first time that I really began to see my daughter's brain power was when she was a toddler. And we downloaded an evolutionary algorithm program that basically painted butterflies. But you got to the butterfly by taking hundreds of sticks and clicking on them, and they would mutate, and clicking on them again, and they would mutate. And it meant moving the mouse across the mouse pad, but it frequently meant moving it beyond the limit of the mouse pad. And I noticed she had figured out how to pick the mouse up, put it elsewhere, and move it again.
Right.
She did that with nobody prompting her.
And that's the trick. You want to do the minimum effective prompting in a realistic amount of time. And sort of working out the time frame of the activity and what questions are appropriate to ask at each juncture to get a very efficient learning curve in which they successfully figure it out, and they get the thrill of figuring out on their own without being told the answer. It's a really nice little practice. And I'm a big fan of the Socratic method, but it's not commonly used in a classroom because it only works really one-on-one. Hard to do it with a group.
That is the issue, right?
I've done Socratic dialogues where I've asked the question of the classroom, and one or two people are doing the answers, and the rest of them are going along for the ride. And the two or three that are doing the answers at the end say, "That was the best lecture I've ever attended." And the rest of them, just went along for the ride. They were in the audience, but not the participants. The smaller the group, I think a group of about a half a dozen. Bigger than that, the Socratic method starts to not work so well because you end up only having two or three respondents that are participating.
It's
I
like
think there's where I like to.
Hermione
Sorry,
and
Jack.
Harry Potter. When a question is asked, it's her hand that goes
Right.
up.
Somebody else, please. Right. Yeah.
Sam, are you fading?
No, I've been listening, but this is where I like to say, in all the various different forums or fora of conversation slash group interaction, I think that a two-person and a three-person conversation have the most magical effect. Beyond that, you sort of get the effect of large numbers.
Yeah.
But twos and threes have very interesting dynamics.
Yeah.
And I think that they're very, very different in quality and purpose and dynamic. But for brainstorming and idea generation and feedback, three is very, very, very interesting. And I think that's a study that I would like to take further in collaborology as well. Two, I think people have studied a lot. Okay. I haven't seen threes studied quite so much.
So the World Cafe set the limit at 4, and that was pretty magical. And that was because you had to leave one of them at the table when the tables broke up and moved to other tables.
Uh,
Um, and so uh, I thought of each table as a guild with a guild leader, and it would be the guild leader who would give the table's report at the end of the session. But it wasn't a guild in the traditional sense where you join a guild and you stay around to level up. It was a guild in a slightly different tradition where you disperse to other guilds, taking what you've learned there and possibly interspersing it at the other tables. So it was really evolutionary programming. It was breeding.
Cross-pollination.
Right. Exactly right. And so I think, is it Susan Isaacson? I think her book on world cafes is worth looking at. And there's probably a lot of online scholarship on world cafes. But I think you really want to go into the online scholarship uh, on RPGs, guilds and RPGs. Because there each role is a small group of people in a larger group, using specific roles as a way of reducing the cardinality of people you're talking to.
You can see why Congress doesn't work with 100 senators or was it 535 congressmen. It's too large a group. They can't do anything. They get gridlocked.
well, in
Well,
theory, they have committees.
they have committees, but their committees are pretty large.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they're
still
too big.
very large.
Too big. They're still gridlocked.
Yep.
And you wouldn't say those are the most collaborative of environments either.
They're collaborative when they agree to disagree on certain points and eject them from the conversation and then go ahead and agree on what they've already agreed on and pound their chest saying, look at the good shit we just did.
They are not learning communities. The they are the antithesis of learning communities.
Right. Of course they are. Right.
You could say up to what, 8 to 15 years ago, even in Congress, there was relatively civil disagreement. People had differences of opinion and principles, etc. But since 2016, that has really deteriorated so that,
Yeah.
principle-based conversation doesn't seem to happen very much anymore at the federal level.
The
Not
argument,
with what's his name in charge.
take a position and defend it to the bitter end.
No, it's not even defended. It's just, pushed onto you. The reasoning has no role there.
Exactly.
My read on history says that it was Reagan that started the downhill slope.
Yeah, it went down starting there, but it really kind of hit.
It accelerated with Trump
Yeah,
because
definitely.
Trump became the kind of the ultimate populist like nobody we've ever seen before. Nasty and rowdy and feisty, and it blew me away that nearly half the nation voted for him.
It's
I,
a sad commentary on the United States.
that's the sad commentary. Yes.
Yes,
It
it was
makes
always there, but it
it
was hidden.
accelerates the rate at which you lose faith in the system.
Well, and more than half the nation, a plurality, voted for him this time. And I'm watching the pundits who say a lot of people who voted for him are going to be sadly disappointed. Well, we could have told them.
Remorse. I called it voters' remorse. It's
Yep.
like buyer's remorse. You buy something and you're disappointed in what you paid for.
Look,
It's going to be the same
look,
thing.
he promised everything in the first term. He delivered what? Nothing. And they actually think he's going to deliver this second term? How stupid do people have to be?
They're very stupid.
And yet we are that stupid.
Yeah.
Bingo. Which why I think again we need to build an ecosystem that slowly but surely affects cultural evolution in a positive direction. That's really what I care about.
Yeah.
Now, what I worry about is time is running out.
Yeah. Well,
Yes, that is
for us
correct.
who are
I
80 years
agree that
old,
that's needs.
our time is running out pretty
Yeah.
fast.
Yeah, somebody on Open Global Mind asked me, "What's the timeline for your project?" And I said, "Before I die."
Yeah. Yeah. We have, if we're lucky, maybe a decade to get something done
That's the point.
before we're in a nursing home and not even able to feed ourselves. So
That's and that's the point. Yes.
Look,
Um,
it takes a generation for a whole new education model to take effect, right? And a whole generation arguably is somewhere approximately 30 years. We don't have 30 years.
well, my
So
kids,
even though it's a good thing to do, yes, we do have to do it, okay? But there also needs to be a parallel effort that has a much more, let's say, short-term impact. And it's not going to be reasonable. It's not going to be model-based. It's not going to have any of those niceties. But yet, the time frame requires that there be a second path through this. And
I
that is a conversation I won't initiate now, but I think it's worth having.
I need you to bring that up when my tribe is in this room, because I agree with you. Um, you know, I've had a lot of left-wing people that say, "Can I use your platform for my campaign for women's rights?" And I say, no, we don't do campaigns. We do learning journeys. And if you can't understand that, I have nothing to offer. But these are the people that want to go out and march in the street and butt heads with people and yeah, maybe that's needed. I mean, it certainly had an impact on the Vietnam War. But it it's not my style, and it's not the way I see the world. And so, I had friends in high school that went out and marched and smoked dope and ate marijuana or ate mushrooms, and I was the safe driver for somebody's bad high once, and took them up in the hills so they could scream. But that wasn't my game.
It strikes me that about a dozen years ago, there was a phenomenon called Arab Spring. Right? It swept through a handful of Middle Eastern countries. And what we saw from those movements were masses of very, very riled up citizenry demonstrating against policies of the government. I don't see that kind of fervor here in the United States. And I think that's actually a point of sadness. You see the citizenry engaged then and there because they knew change was necessary. Here, we still have this very complacent attitude that, oh, yeah, the country is going to be fine no matter what. Okay. I think that is going to be our downfall. That is very dangerous. We don't have that same kind of fervor here in the United States,
Well, so look
unfortunately.
look at it this way. In the Vietnam War, we were we were doing what they did in World War One, which was sending tens of thousands of kids over to be slaughtered. And 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 we had a modern society with television that could actually watch the war in Vietnam in real time and watch their high school buddies being shot down, that kind of thing. It was a new game. And we did similar things in Gulf One. We had embedded newsreels and satellite feeds, and we had stuff. Uh, but climate change isn't like that. Climate change is a slow walk
Yeah.
to do. It burns down this town, and then it burns down that town, and the floods take out this town, and they all just rebuild and keep going because that's what we do.
Climate change is only one of arguably 16 or 17 issues that we're facing with, right? Actually, more prominent, look at racism, look at misogyny, look at class
Yeah.
strife, look at, extraction of wealth from society. Uh, those are not quite so long term. I mean, you could say that the effects have built up over many, many decades. And, the exponential phenomena is you don't see it until the very last moment. But it's been building up for decades.
Yeah.
I'm still
And
bothered by the fact that we moved a whole bunch of Native Americans off to
yes,
desert reservations.
yes,
That
and
we
not
didn't
only moved,
deal with.
millions died. Hundreds of millions of them died.
Right. And I see that in what I'll call the American psyche, and we would try to do that with gays and lesbians as well. I it just it just feels to me like we've gone beyond that. Why do we do this?
We haven't gone beyond that.
Because we're fools. That's why. Homo schleppians, we're fools.
Homo lesbians.
We're just now coming to grips that this country did that. And much of this country doesn't want to admit it. And the other bunch says, yeah, we did it, and it was the right thing to do. That's the ugly. That's the ugly side.
Well, it's bothered me since high school.
Yeah,
I mean, in grammar school we learned about the Indians on the reservation, and we learned this and that and the other thing,
yeah.
all watered down. Um, but it has truly bothered me that we did that, we got away with it.
I'll add one more very personal note. Okay, I came to the United States before I was 6. One of the first things I learned in first grade, other kids pointed at me and said, "Ha ha, you'll never be president." And when I found out what that meant, That was the first, most personal, and very first instance of racism that I felt.
Well,
It was very strong, and I had never forgotten that moment.
it through my lens, I wouldn't label it racism. They were being realistic. It's in the Constitution. But
That is racism.
yeah, you notice in the UK, you've got people from other countries being prime minister, that kind of thing. No, we don't do that. And I don't know why. But yes, it's look, the framers of the Constitution were racist in the first place.
Yeah, and they were slave owners. They thought that,
Slave owners. And so
3/5 of the human was not whole human. Women were not citizens, I guess, with
Good
rights.
known
they
property.
didn't have voting rights. They didn't, yeah,
So,
they were property.
so anyway, this country has it built in. Actually, let me mention again. I know I've mentioned it before. The documentary One City. Have you seen that documentary, 13?
No,
If not, it's extremely powerful and very well done. I
where did you
highly
get
recommend it. 1 3 13. That's all I need to say. It actually, uncovers how the United States was built on a bedrock of slavery and racism. And it's very compelling. And it has some very gruesome scenes, by the way.
Wealth of
Anyway,
Nations was written at the time of slavery. The entire economic model was based on slavery in
that's
Wealth
right.
of Nations.
Yeah. Starting from cotton picking in the South.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, on that note, we are past the 2 hour mark. Jack, Barry, I'm glad you guys have met yet again in a deeper way today. And
Yes.
I look forward to our next conversation, whether it be tomorrow or otherwise.
Well, in theory, I'll be here tomorrow.
Cool. All right. Till next time. Okay, good. Bye bye.